I'm Luke Dawson, a devoted Marine, and loving husband fight to protect my country, while believing I has left my heart safe at home. So I went to Vietnam and my wife started cheating on me. When I returned, I found out that she was expecting his child, and together they wanted to sue me. At the start of 1967, the air was heavy with both hope and fear as Luke Dawson, a 28-year-old mechanic and Marine, volunteered to serve overseas. Known for his strong sense of duty, Luke didn't hesitate when the call came to serve his country, despite the dangers that awaited him on the other side of the world. Before departing, he shared the news with his wife, Emily. Married for 3 years, they lived in a modest but comfortable home, planning to start a family soon. Emily worked as a legal assistant, and their combined incomes made life manageable. Though they weren't rich, they were stable, with enough savings to weather any unexpected events. On the morning of his departure, Luke watched as Emily sat at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup, struggling to keep her emotions in check. "I know why you feel you need to go," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "but I can't help being scared for you." Luke reached across the table, his calloused hands covering hers. "I understand, Em, I do, but I need to do this. I've trained for this and I'll come back to you, I promise." Emily nodded, though her eyes betrayed the fear she felt. Luke had always been the strong one, a man who had faced many challenges and never backed down. In high school, he was known for his quick temper and willingness to throw a punch if the situation called for it. That all changed when he met Emily. She had a calming influence on him, grounding him in a way no one else could. They had been inseparable ever since, and marrying her had given Luke a new purpose beyond his rough and tumble past. That night, as they lay in bed together for what would be the last time before his deployment, Emily held him close. "You better come back in one piece," she said fiercely, "and don't even think about looking at other women. You're mine, only mine." Luke chuckled softly, running his hand through her hair. "I promise, sweetheart. I'll be careful, and you better behave too. I've heard stories about those lawyers you work with." "Don't worry," Emily replied with a playful grin. "You're the only one I care about." Luke spent the next morning getting everything in order. He updated his will, set up automatic payments for the mortgage and bills, and packed his bags. Before he left, he treated himself to a tattoo that read, "Honor before everything," a reminder of both his love for Emily and his dedication to the mission ahead. So when he finally drove away, Emily stood in the doorway, watching him disappear down the road. Her heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. After arriving in Southeast Asia, Luke was assigned to lead a fire team. The heat was oppressive, and the jungle felt like an entirely different world. His skills as a reservist initially earned him skeptical looks from the more experienced Marines. However, it didn't take long for Luke to prove his worth. He approached every situation with calm determination, and after a few tense combat encounters, his leadership earned the respect of his fellow soldiers. Despite the camaraderie among the men, Luke remained loyal to Emily. While others succumbed to the temptations of the local women, he stayed faithful. Even when Lance Corporal Harris relentlessly teased him about Jody, the mythical figure said to swoop in and steal soldiers' wives while they were away. "Come on, Luke," Harris would joke. "You really think Emily's sitting at home, waiting for you? Jody's probably making himself comfortable on your couch right now." Luke laughed off the remarks, brushing aside the doubts they tried to plant. He trusted Emily implicitly and refused to let Harris's jokes get under his skin. He was here to do a job, and nothing could distract him from that. Writing to Emily became Luke's anchor to home. At first, her letters came regularly, filled with news about life back in the States. Updates about the garden, the nosy neighbor, and how much she missed him. But after a few months, the letters grew less frequent. Luke tried not to worry. He knew that sometimes mail took longer to reach the front lines. Still, a nagging unease settled in the pit of his stomach. Then, one day, a letter arrived from his parents. Inside were photos of Emily smiling and carefree, but one picture in particular caught his attention. She was wearing a swimsuit he had never seen before, standing on a beach that didn't look familiar. He couldn't help but wonder who had taken the photo. The unease grew deeper when, during the holiday season, Luke received cards from his parents and friends, but nothing from Emily. The silence was troubling, but Luke pushed it to the back of his mind, focusing on the task at hand. He knew he couldn't afford distractions. By January 1968, rumors of a major offensive began to circulate. The Tet Lunar New Year was approaching, and the word among the troops was that the enemy was planning something big. Luke and his unit prepared as best they could, though the tension in the air was almost palpable. Late in the evening, everything exploded into chaos. The base where Luke's unit was stationed came under heavy attack. Gunfire erupted, and the sky lit up with the flashes of mortar rounds and artillery. So the enemy swarmed their position, and Luke found himself in the middle of one of the fiercest battles he had ever faced. Marines were shouting, bullets were flying, and the air was thick with smoke and fear. Harris was beside him when the mortar hit. The explosion sent Luke sprawling, and when he scrambled to his feet, he saw Harris lying motionless on the ground. Luke's leg throbbed with pain, but there was no time to think about his own injuries. He dragged Harris' body to cover and kept fighting, doing everything he could to protect what remained of his team. When reinforcements finally arrived, Luke was barely conscious, his body battered and bleeding. He had been shot, his leg torn apart by shrapnel, but he had held the line. He was evacuated to a military hospital in San Francisco, where doctors worked to save his leg. The bullet had missed major arteries, but recovery would be long and difficult. His face bore scars from the battle, with stitches running across his cheek and his ear heavily banded. So nurses tried to reassure him that the scars gave him a rugged, distinguished look, but Luke didn't feel distinguished. He felt broken. During his recovery, Luke was awarded the Purple Heart, and he learned that he was being recommended for a Silver Star. He already had a Bronze Star with a Combat V and a Navy Commendation Medal, but these honors brought little comfort. His mind remained clouded with the memory of Harris, of the men who didn't make it back, and of the life he had left behind. Luke's parents came to visit him in the hospital. His father, a veteran of the Korean War, tried to keep things light, though his concern for his son was obvious. "Damn, Luke," his father said, shaking his head. "I thought I taught you how to duck." His voice was filled with the kind of humor soldiers use to mask deeper emotions. His mother hugged him tightly, her tears betraying the fear she had carried for months. "Where's Emily?" Luke asked, scanning the hospital room, hoping to see her waiting for him. His parents exchanged an uneasy glance. We don't know, son," his father finally said, his voice somber. "We've tried to call her, but she's never home. We've been going by the house to check on things, but it's been empty for weeks." Luke frowned, his chest tightening. "What do you mean empty?" His father hesitated, then spoke quietly. "A couple of months ago, I stopped by to mow the lawn, and I saw a man leaving. He was driving a sports car. I didn't get a good look at him, but it was a Corvette, I think." The unease that had been gnawing at Luke's gut for months finally turned into a sinking realization. He remembered the photos, the missed letters, and Harris' taunts about Jody. "Do you know who it was?" Luke asked, his voice tight. His father nodded. "I think it's a guy named Jake. He's a junior partner at Emily's firm." "I haven't seen her since then." The weight of his father's words crashed down on Luke like a tidal wave. His mind reeled, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in the worst possible way. Luke sat in stunned silence as his father's words sank in. The idea that Emily, his wife, his partner, might be involved with another man was unbearable. It was a blow he hadn't been prepared for. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the hospital machinery and the occasional beep of monitors. His mother, always the more empathetic of the two, reached out and touched his hand. "Look," she began softly, "we don't know for sure what's going on. We haven't been able to talk to her. Maybe there's an explanation." But Luke wasn't so sure. Harris jokes about Jody, the diminishing number of letters from Emily, the swimsuit photo taken by someone he didn't know. It all pointed in one direction. He felt a rush of anger, but not at his parents. So he was furious with himself for not seeing the signs earlier. His mind raced, wondering how long this had been going on, whether Emily had been lying to him the entire time he was deployed. "Thanks for telling me," Luke finally said, his voice tight. "I'll figure it out." His father, ever pragmatic, nodded. "We're here for you, son, whatever you need." Luke nodded back, though his thoughts were already elsewhere. He needed answers, and he needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He reached for the phone at his bedside and dialed their home number, hoping against hope that Emily would pick up. The line rang endlessly, each tone like a knife twisting in his gut. After what felt like an eternity, the call went to voicemail. "So, Emily, it's me. Call me back. We need to talk." He hung up, staring at the receiver in his hand. Would she call back? Did she even care? Or had she already moved on with this Jake guy? His heart ached with the weight of it all, but there was nothing more he could do from a hospital bed. The days stretched on as Luke's body began to heal, but his mind remained locked in a cycle of uncertainty and growing anger. Every day he hoped to hear from Emily, to get some explanation for the silence, but nothing came. His parents were by his side as much as they could be, offering support and doing their best to distract him with small talk. But Luke's thoughts always returned to Emily, to the life they had built together and the possibility that it was crumbling before his eyes. So one day, a Navy lieutenant commander entered his room, carrying a stack of papers. He introduced himself, shaking Luke's hand with a firm grip. "I've heard about your situation, Corporal," he said, getting straight to the point. "Your parents mentioned some concerns about your wife, and they've asked for some assistance. I'm here to help with any legal matters you may need to address." Luke had been expecting this. His father, ever the practical one, had suggested giving him power of attorney to manage their affairs while Luke was in the hospital. He had even mentioned contacting a lawyer to help with the process. The lieutenant commander handed over the documents. "These give your parents power of attorney over your finances and property while you're recovering. It will allow them to handle the bills, mortgage, and any other legal matters on your behalf. I've also included paperwork to begin divorce proceedings, if that's the route you choose to take." Luke felt a chill run down his spine. Divorce. The word hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't even considered it as a real possibility until now. But the way things were going, he knew he had to be prepared for whatever lay ahead. "Thanks," Luke said, taking the papers and signing them. "I'll think about the divorce, but right now I just need to know what's going on." The officer nodded. "Understood. I'll be in touch if you need anything else." After the lieutenant left, Luke's father leaned forward, his voice low. "I'll check the bank accounts when I get home, see if there's been any unusual activity, and I'll head over to the house this weekend to see if she's there. We'll get to the bottom of this, Luke." Luke nodded, grateful for his father's help, but still feeling an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had faced down enemy forces in the jungle, survived brutal combat, and watched his friends die beside him. Yet this, the possibility of losing his marriage, was more terrifying than anything he had experienced in the war. The following weekend, Luke's father made good on his promise. He drove to Luke and Emily's house, hoping to find some answers. The lawn was overgrown, the mailbox overflowing with unread letters and bills. As he approached the front door, he noticed it was slightly ajar. A sense of dread settled over him as he stepped inside. The house was a mess. Dishes were piled up in the sink, the smell of moldy food wafted through the air. It was as though the life Luke and Emily had built had been abandoned without a second thought. So Luke's father ventured deeper into the house, calling out for Emily, but there was no response. He moved from room to room, taking in the disarray. In the bedroom, the bed was unmade, the sheets stained. He noticed that many of Emily's personal belongings were gone, clothes, toiletries, but her wedding dress still hung in the closet, and her engagement ring lay discarded in the bathroom trash can. It was a grim sight. He left the house feeling defeated. When he returned to the hospital, Luke could see the grim expression on his father's face and knew the news wasn't good. "She's gone, Luke," his father said quietly. "The house is a wreck. She's taken most of her things, but she left behind the wedding dress and her rings." Luke's chest tightened. It was one thing to suspect that something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed was devastating. He had held on to the hope that maybe there was an explanation, that maybe they could fix things, but it seemed like Emily had already moved on. The betrayal cut deep, leaving him feeling hollow inside. "There's more," his father continued, his voice hesitant. "I checked the bank accounts. She's been withdrawing money for the last 2 months. Nearly everything you had saved is gone." Luke stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. "How much?" "She left about $5 in each account, just enough to keep them active. Everything else is gone." The weight of his father's words crashed down on Luke. He had been so focused on surviving the war, on making it home in one piece, only to find his life in shambles. His wife had drained their accounts, left their home in ruins, and had likely moved in with another man. Luke clenched his fists, his knuckles white. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. His mind flashed back to Harris' jokes, the teasing about Jody. Maybe Harris had been right all along. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry, son. I'll take care of the rest. I've already spoken to a lawyer." We'll get a divorce started if that's what you want, and I'll change the locks on the house. To make sure she can't come back and take anything else. Luke nodded slowly, his mind a whirlwind of anger, pain, and confusion. Yeah, he said, his voice hoarse. Let's get the divorce going. I can't do this anymore. As the days passed, Luke began to focus on his recovery. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional toll of losing his wife and the life they had built together. His doctors worked diligently to help him regain his strength, and slowly but surely, his leg began to heal. He started to move around with the help of crutches and a cane, his body adjusting to the new limitations. But while his body healed, his heart remained heavy. The betrayal of Emily haunted him, and no amount of physical therapy could ease the pain of knowing that the woman he loved had left him for someone else. One afternoon, as Luke rested in his hospital bed, he received a call from his father. "I've got some news," his father said, his voice cautious. "It looks like Emily's living with that guy, Jake. I talked to a few people who work at her firm, and everyone knows about their relationship. She's pregnant, Luke." Luke felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. Pregnant. Emily was pregnant with another man's child, while he had been fighting for his life overseas. The reality of it hit him like a freight train, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "Are you sure?" He finally managed to ask, though he knew his father wouldn't have brought it up if he wasn't certain. "Yeah, I'm sure," his father replied, his voice filled with sympathy. "I'm sorry, son. I wish I had better news." Luke let out a long, shaky breath. It was too much. His wife had not only left him but had started a new life with another man, carrying his child. The anger surged inside him, but there was nothing he could do. Emily had made her choice, and now he had to make his. "Thanks, Dad," Luke said quietly. "Let's keep moving forward with the divorce." "I don't want anything to do with her anymore." "Understood," his father replied. "I've also talked to George Williams. You remember him, right? He used to be a police officer before he retired. He's working as a private investigator now, and he's agreed to look into what's been going on with Emily and Jake. He said he'd do it as a favor to me, no charge." Luke nodded, though he wasn't sure what else there was to uncover. "Thanks, I appreciate it." After the call, Luke lay back in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His heart ached, not just from the betrayal but from the loss of the future he had envisioned with Emily. The plans they had made, the family they had wanted to start, it was all gone now, replaced with a harsh, cold reality. Few days later, Luke received a visit from George, the private investigator. George was an older man, with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He had been a friend of Luke's father for years, and Luke trusted him to handle the situation with care. "I've been keeping an eye on Emily and Jake," George began, sitting down across from Luke in the hospital room. "They've been pretty public about their relationship. It doesn't seem like they're trying to hide anything, but I did manage to overhear a conversation between them the other night at a restaurant. It was interesting." Luke raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "What did they say?" George pulled out a small tape recorder and pressed play. The voices were slightly muffled by the background noise of the restaurant, but Luke could clearly make out Emily's voice, along with Jake's. "So, have you thought about my proposal?" Jake asked, his tone casual but with an edge of something darker. "I don't know, Jake," Emily replied, sounding uncertain. "It's bad enough that I left Luke, and now I'm pregnant with your baby, but what you're suggesting, I don't think I can do that to him." "Come on, babe," Jake urged. "You know Luke's not going to go along with the divorce easily. He'll fight you for everything, but if we push him hard enough, we can get him to agree. We'll get the house, half his income, alimony, child support, you name it." Luke felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he listened. They were planning to bleed him dry. Emily hesitated. "I just don't know. Luke's not the kind of guy to roll over like that, and I don't want to hurt him more than I already have." "Too late for that," Jake scoffed. "Look, if he doesn't go for it, we have other options." "Like what?" Emily asked. "You know, accidents happen. Maybe something happens to his truck, or maybe the house catches fire. Things happen, and then we get everything." Luke's blood ran cold. They were discussing not just taking everything from him, but potentially harming him. The betrayal had reached a new level. George paused the recording and looked at Luke. "I thought you should hear this for yourself." Luke clenched his fists, fury boiling beneath the surface. "They're planning to destroy me," he muttered through gritted teeth. "We won't let that happen," George said firmly. "So your lawyer is already on top of things." He's filing for divorce on the grounds of adultery and abandonment, and we've also got evidence of conspiracy here. They won't get away with this." Luke nodded, his mind racing. He had been prepared for a fight, but now it was clear that this was going to be even more vicious than he had anticipated. Emily and Jake had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. "Thanks for bringing this to me, George," Luke said, his voice hard. "I'll make sure they pay for what they've done." As George left the hospital room, Luke stared out the window, his resolve solidifying. Emily and Jake had underestimated him, thinking he would just fade away quietly, but they were wrong. See, he wasn't going down without a fight, and he was going to make sure they both paid for their betrayal. With his mind set and his heart steeled, Luke prepared for the battle ahead. Luke's recovery continued over the next few weeks, but while his physical wounds were healing, the emotional toll of Emily's betrayal weighed heavily on him. He'd replay that recording over and over in his mind. The moment he realized how far Emily and Jake were willing to go to ruin him, it left a scar much deeper than any physical injury. So there was no turning back now. There wasn't just something to consider anymore. It was a necessity. He spent his days in the hospital preparing for what was to come. Between the meetings with his doctors and therapists, he was constantly in touch with his lawyer, Mike McGregor, who assured him they were moving quickly to get things in order. Every day brought a new challenge, whether it was dealing with his rehab exercises or preparing for the legal fight of his life. But there was a fire in Luke now, a need to reclaim what had been stolen from him. One morning, Luke's father arrived with more updates, as well as a surprise. His father's friend, George, had been busy gathering evidence, and Mike had filed all the necessary paperwork for the divorce. But his father also had something else to share. "Luke," his father said, pulling out an envelope, "this came for you yesterday, from your boss." Luke furrowed his brow as he opened the envelope. Inside was a check and a note from Wilkins, his boss at the auto shop back home. The check was for a significant amount, far more than Luke had expected. "Dear Luke," the note read, "I've been putting away a portion of your pay for when you returned. I figured you'd need it once you were back. The shop's still yours whenever you're ready. Take all the time you need. We'll keep things running smoothly until you can return. So looking forward to seeing you soon, Wilkins." A mixture of relief and gratitude washed over Luke as he read the note. So Wilkins wasn't the warmest man, but he was loyal, and knowing that Luke's job was secure meant one less worry. "So that's not all," his father added with a smile. "I spoke with George again. He found a few more things about Jake. Turns out the guy's been pulling this kind of thing for years. He's known for going after women in relationships, usually wealthy or married, and then trying to manipulate them for financial gain. So this isn't his first rodeo, but it might be his last if we play our cards right." Luke listened carefully, his anger simmering. What else did George find out? Jake's got some skeletons in his closet. He's been involved in a few shady business deals, one of which cost him a job a few years back. He covered his tracks, but George's connections helped him dig up some of those old details. "We can use this if we need to push for more in court." Luke nodded, absorbing everything. "Good, let's use whatever we have." "I'm done playing nice." His father looked at him with a mix of pride and sadness. "So I know this isn't easy, son, but we'll get through it. You'll come out stronger on the other side." "Yeah," Luke said quietly, "but it's going to get worse before it gets better." The day after his father's visit, Luke was cleared to leave the hospital. He still needed physical therapy and was walking with a cane, but the doctors were confident that with time, he'd regain most of his strength. So when the nurse wheeled him out to the waiting area, his parents were there to greet him, beaming with relief. "It's good to see you on your feet, son," his father said, clapping him on the shoulder. Luke grinned, though the pain in his leg still throbbed. "It's good to be out of there. I was starting to go stir-crazy." His mother, ever the caregiver, fussed over him as they made their way to the car, making sure he was comfortable for the drive home. The trip back to the small town where they lived was quiet. Luke stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape pass by, but his mind was elsewhere. He was going back to a life that felt completely different from the one he had left behind. When they finally pulled into the driveway of Luke's house, he felt a pang of sadness. The home that had once been filled with laughter and plans for the future was now just a reminder of what he had lost. His father had already changed the locks and had the place cleaned up, but the house still carried the weight of Emily's absence. As they stepped inside, Luke couldn't help but notice how empty it felt. His mother had done her best to tidy up, but the place felt hollow without the warmth that had once filled it. The thought of Emily, once so intertwined with his life, now felt like a distant memory, a ghost haunting every corner of the house. "I'll be fine," Luke said after a while, sensing his parents' concern as they lingered. "I just need some time." "We're just a call away," his mother said softly, hugging him tightly. "Don't hesitate if you need anything." Luke watched as they drove away, leaving him alone for the first time in months. He stood in the doorway for a few moments, letting the silence wash over him before limping to the kitchen and grabbing a beer from the fridge. He sank into his recliner in the living room, staring at the walls, trying to figure out what came next. The phone rang a few hours later, breaking him out of his thoughts. So it was Mike. "Luke, we've got a court date," Mike said without preamble. "Next Friday." "I know it's soon, but I think that's for the best. We need to move quickly before they try to pull any more stunts." Luke exhaled slowly. "I'm ready. What do we need to do?" "Come by my office tomorrow," Mike replied. "We'll go over everything. I want you in your dress blues for the hearing. You've got a solid case, but we need to make an impression." So Luke agreed, though the idea of standing in front of a judge in full uniform, with the scars of battle still fresh, felt surreal. But he understood the strategy. Mike wanted to remind everyone exactly who Luke was. So a man who had sacrificed for his country, a man who had fought for everything he had, and a man who wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The next few days were a whirlwind. Luke spent hours preparing for the hearing, going over the details with Mike and gathering every piece of evidence they had. George's investigation into Jake's past was proving to be invaluable, and Mike was confident that they had enough to secure a favorable outcome. When Friday finally arrived, Luke woke up early. His leg ached as he climbed out of bed, but he pushed through the pain. So after a long shower, he dressed in his freshly pressed uniform, carefully attaching his medals and ribbons. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. The man looking back at him was different from the one who had left for war. His face was marked by scars, his body still recovering from the injuries he had sustained. But there was a strength in his eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. He had been through hell, but he had survived, and now he was going to fight for what was rightfully his. Luke's parents arrived to drive him to the courthouse. His father, ever the military man, looked at him with pride as he saw Luke in his dress blues. "You look sharp, son." They won't know what hit them. When they arrived at the courthouse, they were greeted by a group of Marines from Luke's unit. They had come to show their support, standing tall in their uniforms, ready to back him up if needed. Luke shook their hands, grateful for their presence. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. On one side of the room sat Luke, his lawyer, and his parents. So on the other side sat Emily and Jake, along with their legal team. Emily looked different. Her once warm and familiar face now seemed cold and distant. Jake sat beside her, his smug expression making Luke's blood boil. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. As the proceedings began, Mike laid out the case with precision. He detailed Emily's abandonment of the marriage, the money she had taken from Luke's accounts, and her affair with Jake. George's investigation provided crucial evidence, and the recording of Emily and Jake discussing their plans to manipulate Luke was the final nail in the coffin. Throughout the hearing, Luke remained composed, though his hands clenched into fists beneath the table every time Jake smirked or whispered something to Emily. He wanted nothing more than to stand up and confront him, but he knew that wasn't the way to win this fight. When it was finally Emily's turn to speak, she looked visibly shaken. She admitted to the affair and to draining Luke's accounts, but she tried to paint herself as a victim of circumstance, claiming that she had been overwhelmed by the pressures of Luke's deployment and had turned to Jake for support. But the judge wasn't swayed. The evidence was overwhelming, and the facts were clear. In the end, the judge ruled in Luke's favor. He was awarded the house, full ownership of the remaining assets, and a permanent restraining order against both Emily and Jake. Emily was ordered to repay half of the money she had taken from their joint accounts, and she was stripped of any claim to Luke's property or future earnings. As the judge delivered his final ruling, Jake lost his composure. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair, and lunged toward Luke. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "You haven't seen the last of me." But before he could get any closer, two of Luke's Marine buddies stepped forward, blocking his path. Jake's lawyer quickly intervened, pulling him back, but the damage was done. His outburst had sealed his fate. After the hearing, Luke and his family left the courthouse, relieved that the ordeal was finally over. The Marines who had come to support him congratulated him on the victory, and Mike shook his hand firmly. "You did it, Luke. Now you can move on." But even as the relief washed over him, Luke knew that moving on wouldn't be easy. Emily had been a part of his life for so long, and the betrayal had cut deep. It would take time to heal, but at least now he had the chance to start over. Over the next few months, Luke threw himself into his work at the auto shop. Wilkins welcomed him back with open arms, and the familiar rhythm of fixing cars and working with his hands was a welcome distraction from everything that had happened. He spent long hours in the shop, rebuilding his life one day at a time. One afternoon, as he was finishing up a tune-up on a customer's truck, Luke heard a knock on the door. He turned to see a young woman standing in the doorway, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and her eyes bright with determination. "Hi," she said, offering him a small smile. "I'm Sarah. Wilkins mentioned that you might need some help around the shop." Luke wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward, shaking her hand. "Luke Dawson," he replied. "Nice to meet you, Sarah. You've worked on cars before." "Yep," she said with a grin. "My dad taught me everything I know. I can handle tune-ups, oil changes, you name it." Luke nodded, impressed. "Well, we could always use an extra set of hands. Let's see what you've got." As the weeks passed, Sarah became an integral part of the shop. She was quick to learn, and her positive attitude was infectious. Luke found himself enjoying her company more and more, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. One evening, after a particularly long day at the shop, Sarah turned to Luke as they were closing up. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I've heard a lot about what you've been through. It's amazing that you've come out of it stronger." Luke paused, leaning against the counter, feeling a familiar ache in his chest. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but I've had a lot of help. I wouldn't have made it without my family, my friends, and this place." Sarah smiled. "So I'm glad you're here," she said quietly, "and I'm glad I get to be a part of this." Luke met her eyes, feeling something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since returning home, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could start to rebuild his life. "Thanks, Sarah," he said, his voice steady. "I'm glad you're here too." As they locked up the shop and stepped outside into the cool evening air, Luke felt a sense of peace settle over him. The scars of the past were still there, but with time they were beginning to heal. And with people like Sarah by his side, the future didn't seem so daunting after all. For Luke, it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about learning to live again, one day at a time. And as he looked up at the stars that night, he knew that he had finally found the strength to move forward, not just for himself, but for the life he still had left to build. Over the next few months, Luke's life settled into a new rhythm. Days at the auto shop were long, but they kept his mind occupied. The shop had become his sanctuary, a place where he could focus on fixing engines rather than thinking about the marriage. Each day brought in new customers, and each night he returned home to a house that now felt more like his own than it ever had before. There were no reminders of Emily left. Luke had taken his mother's advice and gotten rid of everything that connected him to his former life with her. It was a symbolic cleanse, a way of starting over. Sarah became a bigger part of his daily routine at the shop. So at first she had just been another set of hands to help out, but it soon became clear that she was more than just a good mechanic. She had a knack for bringing out the best in everyone, whether it was the customers or Luke himself. Her optimism was infectious, and Luke found himself smiling more often than he had in years. The two of them worked side by side, fixing cars and learning more about each other in the process. Luke had never expected to feel so comfortable around someone again, especially after what had happened with Emily. But Sarah was different. She didn't pry into his past, didn't push him to open up about things he wasn't ready to talk about. She was just there, offering support without judgment. One evening, after the shop had closed and the tools had been put away, Luke and Sarah sat on the front steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that seemed to wash the world clean, if only for a few moments. "You ever think about getting out of here?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice soft but curious. Luke glanced over at her, slightly taken aback by the question. "Out of where?" "The shop," she shrugged. "Out of town, starting fresh somewhere else?" "I mean, you've been through a lot, and sometimes a change of scenery can help. Luke stared out at the fading light, thinking about her words. He had considered it more than once since coming back from the war, especially after the divorce. There were moments when he thought about packing up and leaving, starting over in a place where no one knew his past, where the ghosts of Emily and his fallen brothers wouldn't haunt him. But something had kept him here.
Maybe it was the familiarity, or maybe it was just the comfort of knowing that his parents and old friends were nearby. I don't know, Luke said finally. I've thought about it, sure.
But this place is home, and after everything, I'm not sure I'm ready to leave it behind. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. I get that. Sometimes, the idea of starting fresh is more appealing than the reality. But I guess it's not always about where you are. It's about who you're with.
Luke smiled, appreciating her insight. You're right about that, and besides, I've got the shop.
Wilkins put a lot of trust in me to keep things running. Feels like I owe it to him to stick around and make sure this place keeps going. Yeah, he's a good guy, Sarah agreed. And you're doing a great job here, Luke. You should be proud of what you've built. Thanks, Sarah, Luke said, feeling a warmth in his chest that had been absent for a long time. I don't know what I'd do without you around here. Sarah grinned, nudging him playfully with her shoulder. You'd survive. But it's nice to hear I'm appreciated. As they sat together in the fading light, Luke felt a sense of calm that had been missing from his life for so long. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about finding peace, about figuring out what came next, and for the first time in a long time he wasn't afraid of the future. As the weeks turned into months, the routine at the shop became second nature.
Luke and Sarah worked well together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. Business was steady, and Luke felt a renewed sense of purpose in keeping the shop running smoothly. The customers respected him, not just for his skills, but for his honesty and straightforward manner.
In a small town, reputation was everything, and Luke had earned a solid one. But even as things improved at the shop, Luke knew there was still unfinished business. The divorce had been finalized, but there were lingering issues with Emily that refused to disappear. Jake, ever the Weasel, had filed a countersuit against Luke for emotional distress, claiming that Luke's actions during the divorce proceedings had caused irreparable harm to his reputation and career. It was a ridiculous claim, but one that needed to be dealt with nonetheless. Mike, Luke's lawyer, was handling the situation, but it was clear that Jake was determined to cause trouble. Every few weeks, Luke would receive some new piece of legal paperwork, or a letter from Jake's lawyer, threatening further action. It was a nuisance, one that Luke had hoped would disappear after the divorce, but it seemed that Jake wasn't going to give up easily. One afternoon, as Luke was working on a particularly stubborn engine, Mike called with an update. Look, I've got some news, Mike said, his tone serious. Jake's lawsuit isn't going anywhere, we're going to have it thrown out. But there's something else you should know.
Luke wiped his hands on a rag, frowning at the tone in Mike's voice. What is it? Jake's in deeper trouble than we thought, Mike explained. Turns out he's been involved in some fraudulent business dealings, and the authorities are starting to close in on him.
It looks like he's trying to drag you into it, claiming that you had some involvement in order to shift the blame. Luke's stomach tightened. What? How could he possibly? He's desperate, Luke. He's trying to cover his tracks, and he thinks dragging you down with him might be his way out. Don't worry, we've got everything we need to prove that you had nothing to do with it, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Things could get messy before they get better.
Luke exhaled sharply, the frustration building. Just when he thought he was done with Jake, the man found a way to weasel his way back into Luke's life. Thanks for the warning, Mike, Luke said, his voice tense.
What do I need to do? Nothing for now, Mike replied. Just sit tight. I've got your back on this. So we'll handle it. After the call, Luke stood in the garage, his mind racing. He had hoped to be done with all of this, to have a clean break from Emily, Jake, and the chaos they had brought into his life. But now it seemed like Jake was determined to drag him into something even bigger. When Sarah returned from a supply run later that day, she could tell something was off. You okay? She asked, concern in her voice. Luke hesitated, not wanting to burden her with more of his problems, but he knew Sarah well enough by now to know that she wouldn't let it go. Jake's causing more trouble, Luke admitted, leaning against the workbench.
He's trying to drag me into some business scheme he's been running, probably to take the heat off himself. Sarah frowned, her hands on her hips. That guy doesn't know when to quit, does he? Nope, Luke muttered.
But Mike's handling it. I just hate that it's not over yet. Sarah walked over to him, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. You've got this, Luke. You've already been through worse and you came out the other side. Jake's just grasping at straws. He's going to self-destruct, and when he does, you'll be standing strong. Luke looked at her, appreciating the confidence in her words. Thanks, Sarah. I needed that. She smiled, giving his arm a gentle squeeze. Anytime. As Mike predicted, Jake's lawsuit was quickly dismissed, but the fallout from his fraudulent dealings was just beginning. So over the next few weeks, Luke watched from the sidelines as Jake's life unraveled. Investigations were launched into his business practices, and the rumors of his shady dealings became public knowledge. Emily, who had remained mostly quiet since the divorce, was now caught up in the mess as well, though Luke had no sympathy for her. She had made her choice when she left him for Jake, and now she was paying the price for that decision. Luke, on the other hand, found himself feeling a strange sense of closure as he watched Jake's downfall. For months, he had been consumed by anger and betrayal, but now, seeing Jake brought down by his own actions, Luke felt a sense of justice being served. It wasn't about revenge. It was about knowing that the man who had tried to destroy his life was finally facing the consequences of his own choices. Through it all, Sarah was there, offering support and a steady presence in Luke's life. The bond between them grew stronger, though neither of them rushed into anything more than friendship. They worked together, shared meals, and talked late into the night about everything from cars to life's bigger questions. It was easy, comfortable, and something Luke hadn't realized he needed until it was there. One evening, as they sat in the garage after closing up for the day, Sarah turned to Luke with a question that had clearly been on her mind for a while. Do you ever think about what comes next? She asked, her voice soft but serious. Luke looked over at her, his brow furrowed. So what do you mean? I mean for you. You've been through so much. The war. The divorce. All of this with Jake. Now that things are finally starting to settle down, have you thought about what you want out of life? What's next for Luke Dawson? Luke hadn't given it much thought. For so long, his life had been about surviving. About putting one foot in front of the other and getting through each day. But now, with Jake out of the picture and the divorce behind him, there was a sense of possibility. A sense that maybe, for the first time in a long while, he could think about the future. I don't know, Luke admitted after a long pause. I guess I've just been focused on getting through the day-to-day. But you're right. It's time to start thinking about more than just surviving. Sarah nodded, her expression understanding. You deserve to be happy, Luke. You've worked hard. And you've been through hell. It's time to start building something for yourself. Luke smiled, appreciating her words. What about you? He asked. What's next for Sarah? She laughed softly, leaning back against the workbench. I don't know. I'm kind of figuring it out as I go. But I'm happy here. I like working with you. I like the shop. It feels right. Luke nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. For the first time in a long time, things felt right. So there was no rush to figure everything out, no pressure to make any big decisions. He had the shop, he had his friends and family, and he had Sarah, and that was enough for now. So months passed, and the shop continued to thrive. Luke had built a reputation as one of the best mechanics in town, and business was better than ever. The community had rallied around him after everything that had happened with Jake and Emily, and he had earned the respect of both his peers and his customers. So one day, as Luke was finishing up an oil change on an old Chevy, Sarah approached him with a hesitant look on her face. Look, there's something I've been meaning to tell you, she began, her voice slightly nervous. So Luke wiped his hands on a rag, looking at her curiously. What's up? Sarah took a deep breath, clearly gathering her thoughts. I got an offer from a shop in a different town. It's a pretty big deal. They want me to run the place. Luke felt his heart drop. The thought of Sarah leaving the shop was something he hadn't considered. Over the past year, she had become an essential part of his life, both at work and outside of it. The idea of her moving on left him feeling unexpectedly unsettled. Wow, he said, trying to keep his tone light. That's a big opportunity.
What are you going to do? Sarah hesitated, looking at him carefully. I haven't decided yet. I wanted to talk to you first. Luke nodded, feeling a mix of emotions. He didn't want to hold her back. She deserved every opportunity that came her way.
But at the same time, the thought of losing her felt like another blow. You should do what's best for you, Luke said, after a moment. I don't want to stand in your way. You've got a real talent, Sarah, and if this is what you want, you should go for it. Sarah smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. Thanks, Luke. That means a lot. But I'm not sure what I want yet. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice soft. I don't want to leave if it means losing what we have here, she admitted. You've become important to me. Luke felt a warmth spread through him at her words, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to consider what might come next for them. Not just as co-workers, but as something more. You're important to me too, Sarah, he said quietly. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. They stood there for a long time, the sounds of the shop fading into the background as they looked at each other, both knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. Weeks later, Sarah made her decision. She turned down the offer from the other shop, choosing to stay and build something alongside Luke. It wasn't just about the work, it was about the life they had begun to create together. Slowly but surely, their relationship grew into something deeper. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't dramatic. It was steady, built on trust, respect, and a shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild after hardship. Luke found himself smiling more these days, laughing at Sarah's jokes, and feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The scars from his past were still there, but they didn't define him anymore. He was more than the Marine who had come back from war-broken. He was more than the man who had been betrayed by his wife. He was Luke Dawson, a man who had rebuilt his life from the ground up, surrounded by people who cared about him. And with Sarah by his side, he felt ready to face whatever the future had in store. As they worked together at the shop, planning for the days ahead, Luke realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. And that was more than enough.